Welcome to the second Chapter 8 lecture video on learning and decision making. In this video, we will discuss numerous decision-making problems and errors that supervisors and subordinates fall victim to regularly. This is by far one of my favorite topics in OB, given the profound implication biases have on decision making. In reality, there are hundreds of different biases that affect our decision making. For the sake of not providing too much information, we will cover 20 decision making biases that are common in organizational life. Now, before we can define fundamental attribution error, we need to talk about attribution theory and attributions. Attribution theory argues that we judge people depending on the meaning we attribute to their behavior. That is, we form attributions that explain why people behave the way they do. Attributions can be internal or external. Their internal or dispositional attributions are behaviors that are perceived to be under the direct personal control of another person, whereas external or situational attributions are behaviors that are perceived to be situationally determined and out of the person's control. For example, let's assume someone cuts you off in traffic and gives you the middle finger. An internal attribution for the behavior would be for you to think, wow, that person is a jerk, because you're assuming it's coming from something internal to them being a jerk. Whereas an external attribution for their behavior would be to think, wow, they must be having a bad day. So you're attributing that behavior to something external to the person. It's not that they're a bad person, it's that they're having a bad day. Now, let's say your boss gives you a compliment out of nowhere. You may think, wow, my boss is so nice. That would be an internal attribution. Or you may think, my boss's supervisor must be around keeping track of his behavior, an external attribution. Now, fundamental attribution error is the tendency to overestimate the influence of internal factors or dispositions when making judgments about the behaviors of others. And I want you to focus here on the fact that you are overestimating internal factors when judging other people. So you're attributing others' behaviors to internal factors like personality rather than situational factors like the context. So just to reiterate, because this will be important, this would be an overestimation that another person's behavior is the result of internal factors. So this would be that error that you assume that when something happens that person is doing it because they're mean, they're nice, they're something about their personality, something internal to them. Now, please take a few minutes to review the linked video on fundamental attribution error. As another example, a customer starts uncontrollably screaming at you for no reason. Your first thought might be, wow, that person is crazy or rude. However, there are hundreds of external factors that could explain that customer's behavior. But because you've assumed an internal factor, you're falling victim to fundamental attribution error. Now, self-serving bias also deals with attributions, but it deals with attributions about the self. So fundamental attribution error is about other people. Now we're talking about our own attributions. So self-serving bias occurs when we attribute our own personal successes and failures to different factors. With self-serving bias, positive events or personal successes are attributed to internal factors, whereas negative events or personal failures are attributed to external factors. So let's say you did really well on quiz 1. Because the outcome is positive, you might have thought to yourself, I aced the exam because I'm smart. That's an internal attribution because the positive outcome is being blamed on factors within your control, so your intelligence. Now, let's say you did poorly on quiz 1. Because the outcome is negative, you might have thought to yourself, I failed the exam because Dr. Jordan isn't a good professor. This would be an external attribution as the outcome is being blamed on factors outside of your control, for example, the bad teacher. So please make sure you understand this for the quiz. Good events are attributed to how great you are as a person, so those internal things. Bad events are attributed to some external thing, like blaming the weather, blaming another person, blaming something that is not yourself. So you will notice when comparing the fundamental attribution error with a self-serving bias that it is when rating others, people assume internal attributions regardless of whether the outcome is favorable or unfavorable. Whereas when rating oneself, the attribution is internal when the outcomes are favorable, and it's external when the outcomes are unfavorable. So please make sure you understand these differences. As bounded rationality alludes to, humans are imperfect. We cannot consciously perceive everything in our environment as the amount of information would be overwhelming. As such, humans fall victim to selective perception, which is the tendency to perceive and interpret external cues based on personal factors, like your interest, your background, your experience, your attitudes. This means we're more likely to recognize things we have experience with, things that are very salient, like very bright or large things, the things that we love or the things that we hate, and the things that we are trained to notice, for example, things that are threatening or harmful. The idea that we cannot consciously perceive everything all the time is known as selective perception. So, the picture on the screen is a great example of how our perspective can impact what we perceive. One person sees a 6, another person perceives a 9 based on where they're located or what their experiences are. Because selective perceptions impact how we view the world, they cause substantial differences in how we respond to it as well, which has implications for organizational contexts. So, to give another example of selective perception, if I had generated 100 random items and I flashed them on the screen for a split second, some of you guys would notice certain items and some of you guys would notice other items. And this has to do with selective perception. Some of you guys might notice a spider because you're afraid of spiders. Some of you guys might notice the president because you either like or hate him. Right? This is what selective perception does. Is it allows you to hone into certain things and everybody focuses on different things. As we discussed in chapter 2, a halo effect occurs when you draw a positive general impression about someone based on a single characteristic, and the horns effect is the exact opposite. For example, your coworker is handsome and you assume he is smart and kind. And we already talked about contrast effects in relation to rating job performance, but the concept can apply more broadly to other situations where comparisons are made. A contrast effect includes any evaluation that is affected by comparisons with other similar things or beings. And the issue stems from the fact that evaluations aren't made in isolation, and instead we make judgments based on comparisons. For example, Johnny is a star athlete at his college. When competing against other college students, he looks great. However, if he's competing next to an Olympic athlete, he looks subpar. This is because he is being compared to the athletes around him. That is a contrast effect. And we fall victim to contrast effects when we compare our family, our friends, our peers, our coworkers, or when we compare our classes and our teachers or our meals. These happen all the time. A self-fulfilling prophecy is a general belief that comes true simply because the belief exists. When someone believes in something, their subconscious behaviors often align with those beliefs, making the belief come true. And this leads to a recursive loop that worsens over time. This is why self-handicapping thoughts, or those thoughts that tell us we aren't good enough, are very problematic. And a good example of this is if you think you aren't a good student. As a result of this belief, you unintentionally study and try a little less, which actually makes you a worse student. An alternative form of self-fulfilling prophecy can also happen when others' expectations impact our performance, and this is known as the Pygmalion or Rosenthal effect. In the famous classroom example, teachers were told that half their students were very intelligent, while the other half had below average intelligence. Now, in reality, no real differences existed. However, over the course of several months, the teachers subconsciously gave the smarter children more attention and asked them more difficult questions, which ended up increasing the intelligence of those children more than those who were deemed less intelligent at the beginning. And this is a self-fulfilling prophecy in that the teachers subconsciously confirmed what they believed, which resulted in a change in the intelligence of the students. Overconfidence bias is the general tendency to overestimate personal KSAs and the KSAs of others around us. And interestingly, people with the weakest intellectual and interpersonal abilities are most likely to fall victim to overconfidence bias, as these are the people most likely to overestimate their KSAs. Another really interesting error people fall victim to is anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is the tendency to fixate on initial pieces of information and fail to adjust accordingly when making decisions. With anchoring bias, initial pieces of information act as an anchor or guide for our judgments, and a disproportionate amount of weight is given to that initial anchor, even if this information is wrong or irrelevant. And anchoring is intentionally used in negotiations. For example, think about any pay negotiation you have experienced either personally or indirectly in like TV and movies. What typically happens is that one person provides an initial number. The second person uses that number as a baseline for a counter offer. So let's say you believe your worth and your job is 100K. When applying for the job, your boss offers you 90K. You likely would counter with about 100K. However, if you felt you were worth 100K and your boss offered you 50K, you likely wouldn't ask for 100K because that initial value will anchor and impact your counteroffer. Anchoring also impacts our guesses in uncertain situations. For example, let's say I ask several students to guess the number of people who live in Wyoming. The first student guesses 1 million people. If you know nothing about Wyoming, you will likely use that 1 million as an anchor and choose a number based on that piece of information, as you may assume that the student knows something about Wyoming that you don't. That is the basis of anchoring. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out information that confirms pre existing beliefs while simultaneously discounting information that contradicts those pre existing beliefs. Now, please pause this lecture video and review the linked video, which does a great job of explaining what confirmation bias is and how it relates to self fulfilling prophecies and the Rosenthal study we discussed previously. As the video alludes to, self fulfilling prophecies occur because individuals are looking for information that confirms pre existing beliefs. In some cases, this is intentional, and other times it happens subconsciously. Confirmation bias helps to explain why people listen to radio stations and media sources that tend to agree with their general beliefs. It can also explain why it is so difficult to change someone's religious or political opinion, or their opinions on vaccines, or wearing masks, or their opinions on gun rights, or whatever the best diet is. People will intentionally and unintentionally seek out, focus on, and remember information that confirms what they want to believe while ignoring any reasoning in the opposite direction. Now, conformity bias is the tendency to agree with the larger group even when the larger group is clearly wrong. And conformity bias occurs because choices and decisions made by the masses influence how we think, even against our own personal judgments. A famous example of this is the Asch line judgment experiment. And please take a few minutes to review the linked article on the Asch experiments. Pay particular attention to how the experiment worked and the percentage of participants who conformed to the incorrect answer normally, and what percentage conformed when they had a partner that agreed with them. The Bader-Meinhof effect, or the frequency illusion, is the illusion that once you learn or hear about something, that thing suddenly appears with improbable frequency afterwards. That is, once you learn or hear about something or see it, you start noticing it everywhere. Please take a few minutes and review the linked video as it's a great overview of how the frequency illusion works. Some other great examples include once you learn about a phenomenon, you notice it on TV or in movies more often. Once you learn a new word, you might notice it when you're reading. And once you buy a car, you tend to notice that type of car more often. Now, groupthink occurs when a group of people get together and start to think collectively, often reaching an irrational or dysfunctional outcome. And groupthink occurs because of a desire to reduce conflict and a desire to appear part of the in-group. During groupthink, group members strive for unanimous decisions at the expense of considering alternative solutions or discussing controversial issues. And groupthink explains exceptionally poor decision-making by the masses, or when groups of top management members go along with a crappy idea. On a large scale, some famous examples of groupthink include the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Challenger space shuttle launch. Engineers of the space shuttle knew about some issues months prior to takeoff, but they unanimously decided to push ahead with the launch anyway because everyone feared about speaking up and being out of the in-group. With the Bay of Pigs invasion, President Kennedy made a decision, and despite huge concerns by, most of the people around him, everyone supported his decision verbally. Negative positive asymmetry effect, or negativity bias, is the tendency to register and recall unpleasant information more than positive information. So, not only are most humans more likely to notice negative things, but they are also more likely to remember and recall negative stuff rather than the positive. In fact, it only takes one negative experience to outweigh five positive ones, which is known as the 5-to-1 ratio. For example, imagine gaining $50 versus losing $50. Which is more impactful or memorable? For most people, the loss is more emotionally impactful than the gain, even though the financial amounts are identical. Negativity bias also helps to explain why people can remember bad things in their lives when good things are forgotten or ignored more often. For example, let's say your husband or wife remembers every anniversary except one. Odds are many of you will reminisce on the missed anniversary rather than focusing on the ones that were remembered. This reflects our tendency to focus on the negative and our negativity bias. The availability bias is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood or frequency of an event based on the ease with which examples come to mind. Most people are terrible at making probability estimates. So let's work through an example of this. Stop and think for a second, which is more likely? Johnny is a librarian with glasses, or Johnny is a librarian with glasses who likes to read books. Statistically, the first one is more likely, as only one thing needs to be true. That is the wearing the glasses. However, many people recall a librarian who likes to read books, which biases their judgment when making estimations. Another example of how terrible people are at making probability estimates is the famous Monty Hall problem. Take a few minutes now and review the linked video on the Monty Hall problem. So, another easy example of availability bias is, let's say I want you to guess the number of mass shootings there have been since 2020. Most people overestimate the number, and why would that be? The answer is simple. Mass shootings receive so much media coverage. They're memorable, they're really salient, they evoke strong emotions, which makes them cognitively accessible instantaneously. Thus, you're more likely to overestimate the number because it's readily available in the brain. Action bias is our general tendency to favor doing something over doing nothing, even if the action is ineffective or improper. An action bias provides people with a sense of control or purpose because most people feel it is better to do something than to do nothing. One huge issue with action bias is that it often leads to developing solutions even when the problems haven't been properly identified. So before the real issues are known, people want to act, which ends up being a waste of valuable resources. Framing bias is the tendency to be influenced by the way information is presented rather than the information itself. Because of negativity bias, the framing of information is important, as negative information is more likely to be remembered and recalled. The picture on the right is a great example of framing. So one drink reads 20% fat, and the other drink reads 80% fat free. Although the products are identical, most people would want the 80% fat free option as it implies something positive. Escalation of commitment bias occurs when people show an increased commitment to a previous decision despite negative information or a lack of return on their investment. So it reflects consistency with prior commitments, actions, and thoughts, even against our own self interest. And this is also known as the sunk cost fallacy. An escalation of commitment explains repeated or excessive risk taking behaviors. So let's say you lose $100 at the casino. Your first choice is to walk away so that you minimize your losses. Your second choice is to keep going because otherwise you will lose the money for nothing. Many people will continue to gamble because they feel that they have already invested so much that they can't quit now. An escalation of commitment also explains why people stay in terrible relationships, why they stay employed at organizations they hate, or why they continue to invest resources into something that isn't working or showing returns, like is often the case with small family businesses. Randomness error is the tendency to see patterns in random events. Randomness error often leads people to believe that they can predict the outcome of unpredictable events. And this idea stems from a false causality bias where people attribute the cause of some event to be known when the real cause can't be predicted. And randomness error arises because many people feel the need to create meaning in their surroundings, as uncertainty makes most people uncomfortable. So this leads them to see imaginary patterns in random events, which then leads to errored assumptions similar to what happens with superstitions or certain forms of obsessive compulsive disorders. So, for example, if you did well on a job interview when you wore a certain shirt, and now you wear that shirt whenever you go on a job interview, or if your team wins when you sit in a specific spot, and now you always sit in that spot. These are randomness errors that manifest in strange superstitious behavior. All right, risk aversion. So let's say you're given a choice between two scenarios. Choice one, you receive $5. Choice two, a coin is flipped. If heads, you get $10. If tails, you get 0. Which would you choose? About half of you will choose choice one, and the other half will choose choice two, since the stakes are minor in either choice. Now, let's say you're given a choice between receiving $500 or choice two, where a coin is flipped. If heads, you get 1,000. If tails, you get 0. Which would you choose? In this scenario, most people choose option one because a loss of $500 is very salient. And for this reason, people are generally risk averse, where they choose a guaranteed scenario over an uncertain one, especially when the stakes are high, like in example 2. Now, risk aversion is the tendency to prefer a sure gain of a small to moderate amount over a riskier outcome, even if the riskier outcome might have a higher expected payoff. And the differences in risk aversion can be explained by both dispositional and situational factors. An example of a dispositional factor is psychopathy, one of the dark triad traits we talked about. Not only do people high in psychopathy lack empathy and remorse for others, but they also are highly impulsive and engage in risk-taking or thrill-seeking behaviors. So high psychopathy is associated with low risk aversion. Toxoplasma is a situational factor that can increase risk-taking. Individuals exposed to toxoplasma, which can be transmitted through like cat feces and other things, show higher levels of impulsivity, and research suggests that individuals who are thrill seekers show higher levels of the bacteria in their system. So, toxoplasma will also make people less risk averse. A good example of risk aversion is that most people are more likely to put their money in a bank with a low but guaranteed interest rate rather than a slightly riskier stock that may have a higher expected return. And this is a function of risk aversion. The last bias we will cover is hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is the tendency to believe that one would have accurately predicted the outcome of some event after the result is actually known. And this is where the phrase hindsight is 2020 comes from. It has also been called the I knew it all along phenomena. So let's say you watch the 2030 Super Bowl between the Cleveland Browns and Tampa Bay. Before the game, you have no real guess as to who will win. After the Cleveland Browns win, you tell your friends, I knew the Browns were going to win. This is hindsight bias, as oftentimes we believe we knew the outcome ahead of time, even when we didn't. Now that we have discussed a bunch of ways people make mistakes when making decisions, we need to discuss how we can reduce biases and errors in decision making. The first thing you can do is simply know that these biases exist. Just knowing about these biases significantly reduces the likelihood you fall victim to them. Second, focus on your goals. Goals make us more rational and provide less biased information. Third, look for information that disconfirms your beliefs. Locating, acknowledging, and considering information that is inconsistent with our beliefs can significantly counteract overconfidence, confirmation, and hindsight biases, among many other types of biases. Fourth, don't create meaning out of random events. We cannot always understand the cause of some event. When we don't, avoid creating meaning, as this can counteract randomness error and beliefs in illusionary correlations. Fifth, increase your options or alternative choices. Your best option can only be as good as the option pool you've developed. So develop and consider as many possible options that are feasible as to avoid only creating and selecting biased or erroneous information. I know that was a lot of information, but I hope you found it helpful for your own decision making in the future. As always, please email me at samantha.jordan@unt.edu if you have any questions or concerns.